Hello, everyone, and welcome to this masterclass that we're hosting today. We've got an absolute pleasure hosting a guest that came from a very special company. It's called Stripe. I'm sure you've heard of it before. And today's discussion will be talking about embeddable interfaces. Now, we know that Stripe is the leader in implementing interfaces as such. They really, have taken it further to show how simple it is to take a bit of logic that's very useful to someone that might be wanting to use something within their app and giving that to them, already pre-built and functioning the way it's supposed to be. Now, of course, we at Permit here as well. We've literally also just came out with Permit elements. We designed these elements to essentially embed into any of your applications and also offer these out-of-the-box features where you can configure your authorizations from user management to API key management to looking at your audit logs to maybe controlling emergency access and approval flows and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'll pass it on to CJ and maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Stripe and then we can start the discussion from there.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Hey, everyone. I'm CJ. I work on the developer advocacy team at Stripe, and that involves creating a lot of content, but generally trying to help developers like you integrate with Stripe. And one of the things that I often hear is that developers like to delete code, right? You want to remove stuff from your code base so that you can maintain fewer lines of code and you have like less complexity to worry about. And one of the ways that we like to leverage some of our integration tools is by offering these embeddable UIs. And so, yeah, super excited to talk about that today. If you haven't heard of Stripe before, Stripe is an infrastructure company that is building tools and APIs that millions of businesses around the world, from the smallest startups to the biggest enterprises, use to accept payments, make payouts, and just generally manage their business online. So yeah, excited to talk about some of the embeddable UIs that we're offering specifically for devs to get up and running quickly. But there's a lot of business use cases or business case behind using embeddable UIs too. So yeah, excited to jump in and talk about all of those.
Awesome. And then on the other side, we have my very good friend, Or, who is the CEO and co-founder of Permit, which is the company I work at and I'm the developer advocate at. And maybe, Or, you can give us an introduction into what Permit elements are and what Permit does.
Yeah, sure. So, Permit in general is, as you said, Philip, is a full stack permissions or authorization platform. The idea is that you'll never have to build permissions again. You can, just like you don't want to focus and spend time on building billing or payments, which is not unique to any product. There's no reason why you'd waste time building permissions, which is, again, not unique to your product. The overall theme here is that you as a developer, you have challenges you need to meet. You have core features that are critical for your efforts, and you should focus on them and not some peripheral stuff that isn't unique to you. And specifically with Permit, we're focusing on the experiences. So we have a low-code policy editor that generates policy for you in the form of Rego code. And we have now Permit elements, which we really drew a lot of inspiration from Stripe there. I'd even add the fun fact, when Asaf and I started Permit, and when we co-founded the company, we kept referring to Patrick Carlson, one of the founders of Stripe, as our rabbi, because we kind of constantly learned from their efforts in building Stripe. We saw a lot of similarities. So, by the way, CJ, really thank you for joining here. We're big fans of Stripe. And looking at Stripe elements, we really, as I said, drew a lot of inspiration into Permit elements. The concept baseline is the same. These are things that you need to have in your product. So instead of building them, they're ready made. You customize them, you plug them in, and you can move on. And I think this would be a great point to kind of dive in with you, CJ, kind of learn more about Stripe elements, and where I think a good place to maybe start with is, what are Stripe elements, how you define them, and if I want to get started with them, where should I go to?
Yeah, totally. So we have there is a product at Stripe called Stripe Elements, and Stripe Elements is a set of pre-built UI components that you can embed. That is actually only some of our low-code embeddable UI components. So there's actually a lot more than just Stripe elements. So excited to get into those today. But um, I think
Mm-hmm.
probably the most familiar Stripe element is the old school card element, and that is like, the first real, I think the first sort of like integration point or embeddable UI interface that a lot of people saw come out of Stripe many, many years ago. And yeah, so we'll look at some of those Stripe elements, which are often used to collect payment details from end customers, whether that's a credit card or a bank account or some other payment information. And there's some tricks that we use to keep that really secure, but also really customizable, so it fits in and feels like it's really part of your payment flow. So excited to look at that. And then we have a couple other really interesting embeddable interfaces that allow you to
Mm-hmm.
extend your sort of like your pricing or extend features of your application into Connect. So I do have a demo. Maybe we can jump into that.
Yeah, let's jump into that, and then
Uh,
we can maybe do some questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is the sort of core page for Stripe elements, and you'll see a lot of examples here. What I've done is built out a REPL, so we'll share links, I guess, in the descriptions where you can go and fork this example if you want to play around. You just put in your API keys and you should be off to the races. So this is what I meant by the first sort of original card element that you can embed. So this interface here that has a place where you can enter in your credit card number. It collects, the expiration date and the CVV, and then maybe a postal code. You can use this element to go through and collect payment. Now, I think, or you're in Tel Aviv, Phillips in the UK. So there's people all around the world that are saying, hey, cards are not actually like the primary way that you pay for things in my country, right? So around the world, it's common for most folks who are transacting online to use a different kind of payment method. And so over time, Stripe added many new different payment method types. And a lot of those required building individual elements. And so if you wanted to integrate and support many, many different payment method types, you had to integrate each of those individually until we released this new thing called the payment element. So this is the payment element, and the entire thing that's sort of in this gray box here is all part of the payment element. So it sort of has the same ability to collect card details, but you can also, for example, enter a US bank account, and you can also,
Mm-hmm.
use buy now, pay later methods like Klarna. Now, the payment methods that you see here are based on the currency that I am trying to collect in this form. So one small change, for instance, that we can make is going back to our server here, where we create this object called a payment intent. I can change the payment intent from USD to euros and hit run here. This is going to change the list of payment method types that are displayed in the payment element. So now we see like EPS and P24, ShiroPay, SOFOR, SEPA debit, etc. So this is kind of like showing the power and why we built this payment element. It's because with just a
Mm-hmm.
super tiny change to the UI, you can, or to the underlying data that's backing this, you can extend the functionality really, really far and unlock access to payment methods, which are going to increase your conversion with customers all around the world. So really powerful stuff. So this is kind of the two core Stripe elements.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
I see kind of a recurring theme, and also something that you mentioned is the low code aspect, like
yes.
both saving on your code, but also the interfaces that you provide being low code. I
Hmm.
think that's something, first of all, also something that we dabble in.
Hmm.
And I think it's something that is interesting to double click on, because in the end of the day, there's maybe some irony for like the untrained here, because you're
Hmm.
giving a low code solution for developers to
Hmm.
work with, or to provide to their customers. What's your perspective on low code?
Yeah, so I would actually consider these two integrations to be more of a full code experience, because you do have to write a little bit of code on the server. You do have to write a little bit of code on the front end. While they are sort of lower code to unlock a lot of functionality, these I would consider more full code in comparison to some of our like no code offerings and then a lower code offering. So let's look at something that I would consider sort of lower code. So we have this product called the pricing table. So this is all that we need to drop in to implement the pricing table. We have a script tag that is just pointing at some JavaScript that's hosted on Stripe. And then we're using a web component here called the Stripe pricing table. We pass in some ID and our publishable key. And now what we can do is get this entire pricing table. So if you've gone and built like your own pricing table for a recurring business model where you're, collecting, a monthly fee, or you want to collect a yearly fee, like all of this is built for you and embeddable with just that sort of like two copy and paste lines. And so that's what I would consider more of like a low code integration, which is just kind of like something where you can copy and paste a few lines of code from the dashboard, and then you've got like a full integration ready to go. So that's what, yeah, in my mind, that's like a little bit more low code. Curious to, yeah,
No,
your,
for
your
sure.
your thoughts too.
How do you feel about the tension here between, as a developer, I want to control everything, I want to be able to customize everything, I want it to make it look exactly like my brand,
Yeah.
as opposed to making it easy enough and applicable for wide enough groups of people for it so it will be useful.
Yeah, that is the core tension, right? When you're building any of these offerings. And so we depending on the product, we've tried to strike a nice balance. Now, there's going to be differing levels of how locked down the UI is depending on the interface. So, for example, we can use web components here and quickly spin up and display this pricing table because we're not actually collecting any payment details on this page, right? Whereas the payment element itself needs to be very, very secure. We don't want any of these payment details being sent to malicious users. And so we really have to like lock down what is in this view, but also what is shown in this view because we don't want to mislead any end customers. And so that's like a pretty strong responsibility. The result is that we have this tool. It's called the Appearance API, where you can build out your own. You can like really, really customize the payment elements so that it fits exactly into sort of your view. And so this works based on sort of a few sets of things. So you can start really easily by picking one of several themes. Then you can customize some variables, and then you can really fine tune it by setting individual CSS rules. Now these are all actually controlled inside of JavaScript. So if we look at this sort of like Windows 95 version of the payment element here, yeah, you can like look at the appearance. So this is how we would configure like an appearance object that we then pass in as an argument when newing up the elements. And this allows you to like really control the fine-grained look and feel. But yeah, there is definitely a tension there between like, how much can you expect the end developer to customize and style this thing? How much do you allow that to happen in the dashboard versus how much do you allow to happen as sort of a configuration inside of JavaScript? And furthermore, there's like for the embeddable UIs that do not require like these really secure lockdown experiences, you can actually allow the customer to style the entire thing with CSS that is not sort of firewalled by an iframe. So this is another embeddable UI here that we have for a product called Stripe Connect. So Stripe Connect allows you to facilitate and route payments between multiple parties. And when you're using Stripe Connect, depending on your like sub accounts configuration, so if you have like a Shopify account or if you have maybe like a Lyft driver account, those connected accounts that are built on top of your platform or marketplace, depending on the flavor of that account, you may or may not have access to the full Stripe dashboard as one of those end users. And so oftentimes platforms have to build lots of experiences like showing them all the payments that have come in and showing the payment details. And so this is yet another embeddable UI. This time, because it's not firewalled by an iframe, you can style this whole thing with CSS. And again, this is just using sort of a web component here to build out the entire experience. So this is just saying like Stripe Connect payments using this web component, and then boom, you get like this full experience of seeing the list of payments. So
Another thing that I can kind of sense that is mutual to both our offerings is the aspect of low code generating code. So, for example, before you showed that you can pick that theme, and that generates JavaScript code or presents you with JavaScript code that you can use to then customize. And in general, I think that's kind of the overarching philosophy here. We want to give developers something that is really easy to use and simplifies that work, but does so in the tools and methods that they're accustomed to. Something that you can push into a Git repository, something that you can leverage in the language that you like to write in. So we do the same thing with our policy editor. In the end of the day, it generates code that goes into your Git repository. And I think again that also always kind of touches on those tensions of how much do I generate, how much do I enable them to tweak the generated code. Those are things that we think a lot about. And another recurring theme, I think, is security. You kind of mentioned that a couple of times as you were talking. By becoming a customer facing element, you take on a lot of responsibility, both for the stability of the application itself and for the experience of the end user. And obviously, all of that end to end being secure. Like you don't want to be injecting vulnerabilities or exposing anything. Can you maybe share a little bit about your R&D process around creating something like that? How do you make sure that what you're building comes up to standard, or even in your case, maybe even regulations like PCI that you need to meet?
So I can't go into too much depth about the actual process, but I can tell you that we have teams and teams of people who work directly with regulators. We have teams of people who work directly with all of the different payment method type like companies who are offering those payment method types, and we also have security teams who are constantly sort of pen testing and making sure that we're staying up to standards. We're in close contact with browser maintainers. There is a mobile analog to the payment element that you can use on iOS, Android, and React Native called the payment sheet. And that similarly, we have to sort of like interact with those third parties and make sure that we're following all of the best practices. There is a document that we can link to down in the description that will break down sort of all the security that all this, like the details around the security of using elements that we share publicly. But there is a lot going on behind the scenes, not just sort of making sure that we're following best practices, but also running tests to ensure that we're measuring if someone is acting as a fraudulent person, or has these different red flags that might consider them a bad actor. So there's quite a bit to the security components that are involved with Stripe Elements. So
That's interesting. Another thing that I think is a unique value proposition that can be brought by embeddable elements is kind of a overall upgrade or improvement to the overall experience and overall security. So, for example, with what we do, like we provide you with user management. So, just by the fact that we manage the users and that we are able to audit their actions, we can apply anomaly detection on top of that for everyone without you having to do anything. And I think you're starting to hint here on something similar around fraud. So, are you basically giving fraud protection to anyone who's using your elements?
So there is a product called Radar, and there are several different ways that you can interact with tools to prevent and decrease fraud that's like related to any of your payment flows, whether that's going through Stripe Checkout or through payment elements. So yeah, if you're curious about how to fight against fraud, there are lots of tools, and there's actually like specific products inside of Stripe for helping companies fight against that. So it sounds like in Permit, you're also following that same sort of pattern of, looking for anomalies. I think anomaly detection is really interesting too, especially as we see stuff like, the models that are coming out of OpenAI using maybe like embeddings to see different patterns that people are using to identify and cluster together fraudsters and how they might behave. So yeah, quite interesting. But yeah, I think there's like so many benefits. I think one that we maybe haven't necessarily talked about is how reusable the components are. So like you can just drop them into one project, get up and running. You don't have to like go back and update anything. And they also will just like continuously provide you the best practices. So if best practices are changing and you've already integrated maybe 5 years ago, by using an embeddable UI, you're going to like automatically get those upgrades, assuming that you're integrating correctly and, are pulling in the JavaScript hosted by Stripe every time the page loads, etc. So
Basically making you future proof, which is always a challenge as a developer because technologies are changing, the requirements from your application is changing, so you need to keep up with the times, and then you need to ask yourself which of the technical debt you want to manage yourself and which of it you want to delegate to maybe a more focused party that can bring in specialization and help with that. And another thing that we kind of touched on, or on kind of that on that same point, there's also a question of how much effort do I want to put into something? Because every developer can, I believe at least, any good developer can build anything. Like a good developer, if he decides that he wants to build a billing service, he or she will be able to do so. If they want to build a permission service, they'll be able to do so. But there's alternative cost here, and also a question of where do you stop. So, for example, and I'd love to hear how it is on the Stripe side. With I think with permissions, most people always start with like admin, not admin, and then they go to super admin, admin, not admin, and then usually they graduate to RBAC, role-based access control, and a lot of people stop there. But there's also ABAC, attribute-based access control, and REBAC, relationship-based access control. And things like anomaly detection and user behavior analytics are things that probably everyone wants or would like to have, but not necessarily things that you have the luxury of investing in, which a company that specializes in stuff like that can bring that forward. I'd love to hear where are usually when you meet customers that have started to implement these UIs on their own, where you do you usually find them? What did they do? What did they do well? What they didn't do? What are the pitfalls that usually people kind of stumble in?
Yeah, so I would say similarly have people who might start with a no code solution. So we haven't even talked about some of the no code stuff, which is using payment links where you can just create a link in the dashboard, share that out, and then someone is brought to a Stripe hosted page. We wouldn't really consider that an embeddable UI because it's actually a UI that is hosted on like a Stripe domain. And so what I often see is that people will start out with a no code solution because it is so easy to get up and running really quickly. And then over time, as they push the limits of that no code solution, they might realize, like, oh, actually, I need a really unique feature that is buried down in here. And similar to like how you were saying, they start with admin or not admin and then upgrade to, maybe several different roles and then, all of the different access control models that you might build, you're layering on complexity on top of complexity on top of complexity to ultimately see your vision. And in the same way, we're going to start with maybe a no code payment link solution. Then you might upgrade to, okay, now I want to like host a pricing table that's going to show several different products. Or you might eventually scale your business, become really successful, and say, you know what, I really care about keeping customers on my site. And so now we can invest in using one of these embeddable UI components. And that's where I see most users stop, is they can use one of either the payment element, individual card elements, and that's often something that you can use to scale to really, really massive businesses. Now, if you want to go even beyond that, you can drop down and start building your own UIs and then, sending raw numbers directly to the Stripe API. But that is not recommended and definitely requires, a much higher level of your own PCI compliance. So now you have to start taking on the burden of, going through all these hoops to make sure that your application, fulfills a lot of really strict security requirements. So it is kind of that level of like, okay, am I just am I a startup founder who wants to get started super quickly and I can go in the Stripe dashboard in 5 minutes, have a payment link ready to go? Or are you a massive enterprise that needs to, tweak every single little pixel and you want to, have your own security audits and your own sort of like PCI compliance and all of that, which is, yeah, not fun, I can tell you for sure. So.
Definitely. Before we maybe turn the tables and kind of move to look a little on demo of permit elements, I'd like to ask maybe two things. One is I saw that there's a new customer portal, which is
Yes,
another experience that you provide. I'd love to kind of take a glance on that,
sure.
and maybe some your tips for people that want to now start with Stripe elements. What should they read? How should they start like doing a test application or a demo application? What's the a good way to kick off your experience with Stripe elements or the other low code no code interfaces that you have?
Sure. Okay. So let's start by going. So here in the Stripe dashboard, I have a product. This is a recurring product, professional, two prices. And here we've got a button that I can create a payment link for this price. So this is kind of like the fastest way that you can get started is creating a payment link. I'm going to just create a link, and this will allow us to start a new subscription. So I'm going to copy this link, open it up in the new browser, and we'll go through the payment flow here to start a new subscription. So Jenny Rosen is my example customer. We have this product called Link, which allows you as an end customer to quickly authenticate with a one-time PIN, and now you're logged in and you've got all of your payment methods saved, so you don't have to like go through and add all of your stuff. Just like quick sidebar, I love going to this little ice cream shop that's like right down the street from my house. And I go there in the morning because they have really great coffee. It's an ice cream shop, but they have like really delicious coffee. And often I'm walking my dog. And so instead of like bringing the dog in the store and whatever, I want to like mobile order for the coffee. And so in the app that they use, every single time I have to enter my full credit card and my full name and like all of the details. And it takes me like 5 minutes. And right now in New England, it is freezing cold. So it's like basically 0 degrees. Everyone will know what 0 degrees means. And so I've got my like gloves on. I'm trying to type it in. It's super slow. So I really think that, offering Link and faster, I don't know, a faster way to pay is really, really critical going forward. Like everyone's going to sort of expect this. All right, so we've got a brand new subscription. We can go back to our dashboard here. This is the new subscription that we just created. Now, what's really cool is we have this product, like you mentioned, called the Customer Portal. Now, this is another Stripe hosted surface, so this isn't really embeddable, but anyone can come to your site. You can like really easily add a button to maybe like your settings menu inside of your application that will say like, show me my billing. And that will make an API call to the server to create a billing portal session that you then redirect customers here. So I would say it's like one of the simplest integrations. There's two arguments. You put the customer ID and the return URL. And from here, you can do all kinds of stuff. You can update your payment methods. And these are going to like reuse those same embeddable UI components to build on top of this hosted surface. So now we're seeing the payment element there. We're seeing, lots of these different tools directly inside of the customer portal. So if I want to like switch my plan, we can do that directly here. We can also cancel here, and all of the sort of settings for what is available inside of the customer portal are in the Stripe dashboard. So you don't actually have to like change any code to unlock any of the functionality or features that you're seeing in the customer portal. So yeah, pretty powerful stuff. Huge fan of the customer portal for sure.
Yeah, it looks amazing, and I love the interconnectivity. So you kind of like get this classic back office where you manage everything, and then you can kind of zoom in into parts of it, into create different views for your end customers.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. There's lots of different sort of building blocks or like sort of Legos that you can snap together more quickly to build your business. And like you said, now you don't have to worry about authorization controls or role-based management, and you don't have to worry about billing, and you don't have to worry about collecting payment details. And so hopefully businesses and indie hackers, or if you're out there and you're thinking about starting a startup, like hopefully this is decreasing your stress level and giving you confidence that you can really quickly test something out and try to build a business and ship it so that you can go out and create value in the world, and you don't have to spend all the time building these components yourself. So Yeah.
Amazing. So cheers to that, and I think this would be a good point to kind of pass the baton to back to Philip to do a demo of permit elements.
I'm
Yeah,
excited. Let's do it.
absolutely. I'm excited too. And just to follow up on the last thing you said, I think I can tell from personal experience that a lot of developers have that pressure of having to implement things and build apps, and suddenly they think, well, how do I implement the billing? And they start thinking, well, I need to focus on this and on that, and I need to make sure that this is secure and that is secure, and it like causes stress and panic, and suddenly they're looking for ways to make it easier. And I think the same thing we did with authorization. Authorization is something that is very hard to build, it's very hard to implement, and once developers actually start to think about it and think about the future and future-proofing their product, it becomes very stressful. You don't want to write these things yourself. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of explain what we essentially do at Permit. And give you a little insight into permit elements in itself. But before I do that, let's talk a little bit about permit and what essentially we do and what it looks like. So like we've mentioned previously, permit is a low-code, no-code solution for managing your authorization. Now, the main idea here is that obviously we don't want these companies having to stress about this building of authorization themselves. We want to offer something that's pre-built so they can actually go ahead and focus on the real value of their product and the thing that they're actually trying to build, and making sure that they can get started as fast as possible. Now, within Permit, we have something called the policy screen. Now, within the policy screen, we allow the users to manage essentially the policies for each role that they create. And to add to that, for each role, they can configure the resources and the actions that apply to that specific role. So later on, when you actually embed Permit into your application at application level, you're able to specify a very simple function called permit check, where you check you check the currently authenticated user, you check the action that they're performing and what resource they're performing on, and it's all related to the role that they have essentially been given. Now, with Permit, we try to also, lower that confusion level and make sure that everything is very simple to use. Hence, we have this very simple no-code interface for managing your policies, where you can create new roles, you can create new resources, and it's as simple as checking your policies. Maybe you don't want a specific role to have access to folder, or maybe you want administrator to not be able to delete the document but have access to the server room. You can save those changes, and those essentially policies get updated in real time that later on you can control within your app. Now, the other panel we offer is we have the ability to manage users, and all the users that get authenticated into your platform through the authentication provider of your choice can then be also synced into Permit, and as like I said, you can then give those users the specific roles with the specific policies and permissions that they can do within the app. So that's a little bit of a background of how Permit works. And now I actually want to dive into Permit elements to kind of show the similarities that what we're trying to do is creating those embeddable UI experiences that really make it easy for new developers to get started and take that headache away from them. So here we have the Permit elements screen. The first element that we're going to create is the user management. This is essentially taking a whole different concept of essentially managing permissions. Now, as you saw previously, or actually maybe before I do that, I'm going to go back into my users. You can see that I have all these users configured. I have SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, Krabs. Clearly, by this demo, I am a SpongeBob fan. And essentially what you can see is that all these users and all these roles are configured. And then within my policy, I have several roles. I have the administrator, I have the manager, I have a super admin, I have a temporary role. I call that temporary because I'm going to explain it in a second. And I have a viewer role. Now, if we actually go back to the elements and I'll create an element, you'll see that all these roles that we have configured appear in this hidden role section. Now, this is where the very interesting and very complex concept of authorization for authorization comes in. You have specific roles configured within your system or your application. You have those roles assigned to users that have the permissions to do the right things that you've configured for them. But what if you want to delegate those roles and give them extra permissions for specific embeddable elements? essentially meta permissions to be able to do specific things within the component. Now, that's what you can see on the left-hand side. You can see exactly what I just said. So the meta permission levels that you can apply to specific roles that are already in your system. And on the right-hand side, you can see the live preview of those roles and of what the element is actually going to look like. Now, before I start, I'm just going to call this the user management element. And essentially what we can do is we can start giving those extra permissions to those roles, either exceeding those permissions or limiting those permissions for those specific users with the roles that have been configured within permit. So I have dragged my super admin role to the workspace owner. So now anyone who has been assigned the super admin within permit will now have the workspace owner permissions for this specific element. So the more roles I add to the more meta permission levels. So maybe I want my manager to be my manager. Maybe I want my viewer to be my viewer. I'll make my administrator also a workspace owner of this element. And as I'm adding these roles, you can see that those users with those roles start to render within this element. And as you can see, this live preview is there specifically rendered for anyone with who has the role assigned to the meta permission level of workspace owner. Now, within this live preview, we actually have the option to change this level. So we can maybe view the element as someone who is a viewer. So all these controls of inviting new users suddenly does not become available. Maybe the controls of changing the role do not become available. So as you can see, for any company who wants to start using elements to maybe delegate and give the access to their customers or to their extended team to manage certain permissions and manage users for a specific section of the application, for example, well, those permissions suddenly become easily implementable and they can embed this into their application. The other thing I want to go for it.
I was going to jump in. Yeah, no, I think this is
absolutely
a really important part of building with this new sort of embeddable UI model is offering a preview like this. So for all of like, you know, the embeddable interfaces that you will eventually see in your application, sometimes it can be hard to like visualize what that will ultimately manifest as. And so this is great, being able to see like, okay, if I'm a level 3 viewer, how will the members list appear to me? So this is, yeah, I think like if you're thinking about building embeddable UIs or dev tools, this is a really, really critical component to it. And I think especially when you are letting people change the design or mess around with, you know, what does it look like on desktop versus mobile? I think it looks like you have in your preview there the ability to switch to the mobile view too, Philip. And so,
yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
like these little previewers, I think are really, really key.
That's essentially the idea of permit elements, is to allow those users to see what they're creating, to be able to play with it before it actually gets implemented, and to really see the final outcome of what their configuration is going to look like and what it's going to work like in this case. Because, for example, if I go back and change myself to a workspace owner, well, maybe I can add someone new, for example, and assign them the role, and I can send that invite. Of course, they get that functionality here, but we get a notification that that functionality doesn't actually take effect inside the element because this is a preview. But they can go ahead and see what it works like. Now, of course, there is a lot of different steps here that you can also do. You can configure the element. For example, the default role, maybe I want it to always be a manager, so that always gets changed to default. Maybe I want to change the theming. Maybe I want to hide the title, show the title, change the title to something more appropriate with my system and my application. We can also change the color of the element. We can also change the primary color. So if I actually go ahead and say info@permit.io as a more generic email, you can see that this primary color is configured. Well, of course, we can also change that to something that maybe is a little more appropriate for a brand, and the text and so on and so forth. Later on, you get also other management features like do you want to show the full name? Maybe you just want to show the full name in the element, and you still get that live preview for all of those roles as above. Of course, the functionality can extend from here. We can then configure webhooks. Maybe you want to configure a webhook for whenever someone, your customer, your extended team, or someone at the end of the permit element, the end user invites someone to the system, well, maybe you want to have control and know when someone gets added. Maybe you want to configure this to send email notifications to you when that happens, and so on and so forth. So essentially, this is the concept of permit elements in itself, and the ability to create those permissions and manage those meta permissions, and that authorization for authorization aspect, which is in itself quite recursive. Now, once we're happy with this final element, we can actually create it. And what happens, it actually creates the style, asking you if you're ready to embed this element into your application. Now, it becomes quite simple from here on. You can get the code. You can copy this code snippet. Essentially, it's an iframe provided to you with a unique source URL that essentially impacts what the element shows up on the actual end application. Now, because I already have a configured application for this demo, I'm just going to jump into my code and change this iframe to be something different. And then, as part of this process, there's two other things that you need to do. You essentially, whenever, as you're using permit, you need to authenticate that user and get that unique ID of the user through the authentication provider. So you fetch that from inside the JSON web token that you get when you authenticate that person, and you make sure that their identity is correct and he's actually who he claims to be. And then, of course, once you check for those permissions with an element, if you're logging that user in, you also want to log that user into the element, and vice versa. If you're logging them out of the element, you want to log them out. Now, because I have embedded this code within the application, I can actually go onto the React app that I've created. Very, very simple. We don't want to overcomplicate anything here. And I can have the option to either log out or access that permit element. And in this case, I want to access that permit element. And as you can see, because I myself, within the application, specified that the person that's currently logged in, I am the super user, so I gave myself the permission and the role of a super user, you can see that element be rendered in my screen the way it is, and I have full control over it. I can invite new users, I can change the role of certain users. For example, maybe I want to make Patrick the manager now, and that has been done. But I think the really cool thing that I want to summarize this with is how much flexibility you actually have to change those permissions once you already created and embedded everything. Now, specifically with authorization, it becomes very complex once you maybe have a solution in place, but then you need to add new roles, you need to add new permissions, and you need to dive into your code, and you need to change those permissions. And what happens if you need to change the permissions for another 10 people? What happens if you need to add another 10 new roles? Well, suddenly that really becomes difficult to do, and it's very, very time consuming. Now, in this case, with what we can see now that the element has been embedded, if I actually refresh the page, we can see that this iframe has been successfully embedded and is working within our application. And let's assume that maybe all the super admins, which is, for example, me, myself right now, that's the role I have assigned myself, you only want to make them the viewer. Well, it's just the case of dragging this meta permission to a different meta permission level. You save this iframe. It asks you, do you really want to update the iframe because it's already in the app? We say yes. And then it's as simple as that. We can go back to our app, we can refresh, and suddenly I've lost all those permissions to invite new users, to change those user roles, and so on and so forth. So I think I'm happy to kind of continue the discussion and see where it goes, but I guess we can end the demo here.
I think there's some cool things to highlight, and then I'd love to kind of hear some questions from CJ if he has them.
Sure.
So one interesting thing that is also kind of appeared on two of the demos is kind of how you authenticate or how you verify the identity of the user. So with your demo, CJ, you showed how you can use one-time tokens to on the fly authenticate the user or get their identity, or at least some kind of identity. And Philip talked about how you can leverage the authentication already in the application to log in the user also into the element. I think that's also something that is available in Stripe elements. And another interesting thing here, I think, was the challenges around customization, around how you make this useful. And Philip only showed the user management element, but there's also other experiences like audit logs and approval flows and invites and permission requests, things that most people probably seen in a billion different applications. And another thing that we saw here that is different actually to the Stripe demo is that we saw the secured by permit IO label. So that label is for paying users. It's you don't have to stick with it, but we actually think that that is something that is required and end users would actually like, because in the payment space there's regulation. So when you're coming into a credit card solution, it's going to meet PCI. Otherwise, banks are not going to accept that payment player. With authorization, those standards don't exist yet. So we're essentially trying to promote a new standard and saying there are different types of user management and access control interfaces. They're not all the same quality. Not all of them take care of your security the same way. Not all of them apply anomaly detection. Not all of them make sure that it is communicated through secure protocols. So that's, I think, that's a different thing that up till now we were talking mostly about things that are common and mutual. So that's a different thing, but I think it still touches on kind of the same principles. CJ, I'd love to hear your thoughts or questions.
So I think maybe around 2012 I implemented a solution that was similar to this in an application, and I found that one of the hardest parts for me was adding all of the functions that wrapped every action that someone could take to make sure, like, do they have access, do they not have access. So I'm curious if you have that as part of this example, Philip, to look at. And then maybe, like, while pulling that up too, I think the idea around using JWTs is like I don't know, it's relatively new, but I think that's an interesting piece of the puzzle here, is that for a long time we used sort of just like, basic like HTTP basic auth, or you have your own custom user token auth that uses the database directly. But by using JWTs, you can kind of see how all of these different services can plug into your own architecture and take advantage of those authenticated users. And so this is, I think it's like a way that if you think about server or like service oriented architecture, instead of building all of those services yourself, you can now start to pull in these third-party services that you're integrating and take advantage of those using sort of the same underlying technology. So yeah, I think it's a really powerful paradigm, and obviously we expect embeddable UIs to be really useful to users. So yeah, would love to see kind of like how you check to make sure that someone has the right permission to take an action.
Yeah. As Philip pulls that up, I'll kind of maybe add some color to that. So we definitely think that JOTs are the standard way to go, and that's the default way that we connect as a permissions provider, how we connect your authentication or identity provider. And when you provide a JOT, you can essentially pass that as an object directly to our SDK. So Philip mentioned our main SDK function is called permit.check, and you pass it identity, resource, and action. Essentially, this is what's happening now. And so you can just pass the decoded JOT as the object for the identity. And then what happens is that the claims in the JSON Web Token, those become attributes for the identity, and then you can use it as part of ABAC policies in permit. So we showed role-based access control policies, but the low-code policy editor also generates attribute-based access control policies. So for example, there's a concept there we call a user set. A user set is like a role, but instead of being defined by a label, it's defined by a set of conditions. For example, let's say you want a user set like US paying admins. Mm-hmm. So you'll say you're a US paying admin if you have the following conditions met. Your role as an admin, your geolocation is the continental US, and your Stripe billing status is paying. Mm-hmm. So, and you can get your geolocations, for example, that can come in your JOT as part of your identity. The billing information can be synchronized through Opal. I won't go deeply into that, but our real-time data update integration funnel. So you can pull that from Stripe. You can pull in the location or other claims about the identity from the authentication. And obviously the role management is already kind of baked in here. And you just define that as a user set, and that immediately becomes a new role-like entity that you can interact with, and you can assign it the same permissions as if it was a role. You just check the boxes.
Hmm.
And you can do the same thing with resource sets, which are resources that instead of being defined by a label, they're defined by conditions. For example, it's a file that has more than 1 GB, or it's a task that has been checked or not.
Hmm.
In general, we like to say that the policy editor is an interface simple enough for a monkey to work with, or maybe even a product manager.
So,
That
so
joke is actually loved the most by product managers, ironically.
is so I assume that there's also like an API where you could toggle that attribute on a customer based on maybe like some, webhook event fires in from the customer portal. Like someone takes an action in the customer portal to cancel their subscription. That's going to fire a webhook that you could handle part of, like some Lambda function or your server. And then like from there you can make an API call to permit to say like, okay, remove this specific user from this
Yeah.
policy,
So
right?
if we go to api.permit.io, you can see that everything that we've seen here, without exception, is API driven. Every little thing you can automate through the API from whichever code running context that you have. Another feature that we have though is the Opal architecture. So Opal is a real-time channel to update your world picture for authorization in real time. So you can actually send the webhooks directly into Opal as instructions on where to fetch data from. So for example, you can configure a webhook at Stripe, pointed at the Opal server on permit, and that will propagate to the potentially thousands of microservices for authorization, or even millions of microservices for authorization that they have. They will receive an update telling them, go now into this URL in Stripe, fetch the data, and load it into your policy engine. And that happens, that policy engine is running on the customer side. In general, a unique thing that is important with authorization is high performance. For every request that you have in a microservices based architecture, you usually do an average of 3 authorization queries. And so if for each of them you had to go to Permits Cloud, you're going to kill your application very quickly. So instead we provided microservice that container or sidecar, ideally, that would run on your side. And it keeps being updated through Opal in real time on your side. So it answers everything from that live cache, but it propagates everything in real time. So even though things are changing, it's always up to date to answer the authorization queries correctly.
Very cool. I like it. And then on the
Thank you.
front end, like for the embeddable components, I know you mentioned there's one for audit logs. I'm assuming those are similarly configured and you have a previewer and yeah, they can just like copy and paste those directly in.
Yeah,
Very cool.
exactly the
Very
same
cool.
concept. So
Nice.
the idea there, so you have audit logs within Permit for you as the vendor. So you
Hmm.
can see what all of your customers did. But you want for each of your tenants, a tenant is also a concept within Permit. You want to enable each of your tenants to see only what they did within the product.
Hmm.
And that's just ready to be embedded. So when your customer needs to know for their own regulation, compliance, or just baseline security, you can set that, and you can embed the interface, and they can see their own audit logs. I think in this specific project that there are no audit logs yet, but
Yes, correct. There is no audit logs. That's why nothing is displaying.
yeah, but in general, you can see what everyone did, and the audit logs are auto-generated by the permission query itself. So we kind of deduce, oh, you checked for this permission, so that means that you're trying to do that action, and that will be recorded and viewed.
Got it. And is that, I assume that is always available both client side and server side, but I'm guessing mostly, in terms of best practices, you want to do things on the server so that people aren't just clicking around in the browser and removing your access control.
So everything in general with authorization, everything has to be enforced on the backend side.
Hmm.
Anything on the front end side is vulnerable, so you don't trust that. You can render experiences accordingly on the front end side. You can provide the experiences to manage the access control plane through the front end side. But everything that is enforced has to be on the backend side critically.
Yep. Cool.
Awesome. Um, Other questions or thoughts before we wrap up, I guess.
No, yeah, I think there's definitely a trend about offering your developers varying levels of tools and building blocks to build whatever they need to build or want to build. And so, yeah, it's an exciting time to be a developer because I think there's a lot of things that you don't have to build anymore. So, yeah, I'm definitely excited to see where the trend goes and, you know, what other things are available to us as embeddable UI components for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the more things that we can take off our table, the more things we actually do that are more unique, more cutting edge, more core technology that is unique to a specific company. And this will just enable more room for innovation. And I'm excited to use all of these tools that will emerge out of that.
Absolutely.
More time that was bought.
Yeah.
Awesome. CJ, thank you very much. It was a blast to have you with us. It was really great to learn about Stripe elements, to learn about elements in general and embeddable interfaces. It was cool to see the similarities and differences between how we build it and how you build it. And I look forward to talking more in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Or. Thanks, Philip. Appreciate it.
Thank you, CJ. We appreciate it. And anyone who's watching this, all the links will be down in the description of this live video. So please make sure to go check them out. Go play around with Stripe. Go play around with Permit. And we'll see you in the next masterclass.
Bye,
Bye.
friends.